Right, we're trying this one last time. This is the next section of our virtual book report, as I've been calling these, on C.S. Lewis's The Reading Life, The Joy of Seeing New Worlds Through Others' Eyes, which is a really long title, so from here on in, let's just call it The Reading Life. These sections that Lewis wrote are a bit more scattered, less focused than the previous ones. So this will be a bit of a quicker book report, and we're going to dive right in, starting with the case for reading old books. This piece was first printed in, I want to say, 1944 as an introduction to a newly translated treatise by a guy named Saint Athanasius. Only bringing that up because if you were reading through it, you'd notice that there's an odd focus on Christian theology and writings, which I guess it's not that odd for C.S. Lewis, but for this particular piece, that's why you'll notice this here, because again, it's a foreword for this book. And so while Lewis is going to make an argument about why we should read old books in general, this foreword, this introduction, is also saying, and you specifically should read this old book. Here's why. The opening that Lewis is going to, introduce his argument is essentially going to be about a conflict between primary and secondary sources. Lewis is going to use Plato to talk about all of this. For modern readers, he says, instead of reading Plato, you might get directed to someone's commentary on Plato. He views this as a problem because that commentary is going to be longer, and it's not going to give you the full text, and it's going to be someone telling you what Plato said instead of you reading what Plato said, which for those of us who put a high value on primary sources, we see why that's a problem. Lewis credits this to a reader or student's humility. The reader says, yeah, you know what? I can't read that in the original language. I haven't read a lot of the history. I haven't read what other people think about this. So I'm not going to understand Plato. Lewis says, doesn't matter. You should still read it. That's what you're thinking there is a wrong way of thinking about it. So let's dive in one more time. For Lewis to, he acknowledges that you're right. You can't read the original language, and you're right. Other people have written about this. In fact, Lewis says, I'm one of those people who has written about these old books. And so I'm going to tell you something that goes against my interest, Lewis says. Read the old books instead of the new one if you've got to choose between the two. The authors for the book, which you can see back there, Colin is reading it right now, used the same pull quote that I was going to use, so that just lets you know that we made the right choice here. The quote is this: every age has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period. And that means the old books. Lewis acknowledges if we could get books from the future, that would also solve this problem, but as that's impossible, our main source is going to be the old books. Why? It goes back to the full thesis of this book, that there is importance and value in reading because you get other people's perspectives, and in this case, you get other times' perspectives. This lets us avoid a modernist or a recentism trap, and it helps us by keeping the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds. That's it. That's this first section. Very short, very sweet. It's also not objectionable, and the argument itself not particularly intricate, which is what you would expect from a simple foreword, which is why I always say don't bother reading the forewords of books, just read the books. Next up is a more traditional Lewis argument on the role of the marvelous. This comes from Lewis's On Stories, where he describes a little bit more, what is a good story. So just ignore arguing over what is a good story for this piece, because his thesis is that good stories often introduce the marvelous or supernatural, and nothing about the story has been so often misunderstood as this. we're back to talking about myth, the marvelous. Lewis again asserts that, hey, you're wrong if you think kids like this because they're too stupid to not realize the marvelous dragons, whatever, aren't real. In fact, Lewis says that belief is at best irrelevant to enjoying these stories. So, what does Lewis mean here? Well, the marvelous in a good story isn't just there because the dragons are neat. This marvelous, this fantastic element serves a purpose. Because for Lewis, stories aren't just arbitrary fictions. He says that the logic of a fairy tale is as strict as that of a realistic novel, though it is different. In modern parlance, we might call that suspension of disbelief, right? You'll believe Harry Potter can fly a broom, he can cast a spell, you'll believe that there's a school for wizards, right? You won't believe if he goes aboard a spaceship. You won't believe if, he hacks a computer through, a cyberpunk style interface, right? Because fantasy has rules, and God help you if you break those rules. So speaking of these rules, Lewis is gonna, explain that in his own way, talking about Mr. Toad and friends. He mentions that they are animals and fantastic creatures solely because you now follow a different set of rules than if these were real people, right? It's the same thing. You'll see the same thing with Star Trek, and I like talking about how Star Trek is a great, science fiction fantasy thing. As long as you don't look at it too hard, you don't look at the parts outside of the fiction, right? Same thing with Mr. Toad and Friends. Don't ask where he gets the beer, how he fixes his house, who does the cooking, what are the logistical supply chains to get all of these things out to them. Because the one absurdity, we're on a spaceship, Mr. Toad is a toad, helps to hide the other absurdities. Because he's a toad, because we're on a spaceship, because Harry Potter is a wizard, we've just told you by giving you these facts, ignore the rest of these rules that you would associate with real life. Because you can enjoy the story for what it is meant to be instead of trying to staple reality over it. Which I don't know if Lewis ever wrote anything on this, but I think he would agree here that you can just accept stories as the stories without trying to make it a perfect, logical, rational thing. Like, nothing's more frustrating than trying to, talk about some bit of fiction and someone's like, yeah, but it wouldn't really work like that. And we're like, yes, that's why it's fiction. Anyway, Lewis goes on, closes it out by saying, this excursion into the preposterous sends us back with renewed pleasure into the actual. The argument here is essentially that in favor of a healthy level of escapism, similar to the arguments made in section 2 of this book report. The next 3 sections are much more autobiographical, and I think they're important to understanding who Lewis is. Now that we have seen him as Lewis the writer, Lewis the academic, we get a chance to see Lewis the human being. Growing Up Amidst a Sea of Books is an excerpt from Surprised by Joy. It's maybe like 4 or 5 pages long. I think in the written script I say 2, and that's wrong. Anyway, so this is very autobiographical. There's a few excerpts I want to talk about just because they're interesting stories. Anecdotes, really. C.S. Lewis is talking about his father, and he says his father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them. And I kind of wish I had done that instead of, like, for 3 or 4, maybe 5 years. I read mainly library books, and now there's that nagging annoyance when I want to, reference one of them, and I don't have it. I don't have it on my shelf there. I don't have it on my shelves over there. It's just gone, lost forever, unless I go out and buy a new copy. Particularly, there's this really great copy, footnoted copy of Being in Nothingness. Like, the translator both talks about some of the history in the footnotes, references other works by the same or related authors. I remember at one point he's like, I was going to translate this French term to mean this, But then I went and I looked through the author's letters, and in one of his English letters, he uses this term instead of, what the direct correct translation is. So I'm using that term instead. And I don't have that book. I don't think I'll ever find that book again. So just, buy your books. That's the point of this anecdote. He also, Lewis, I think, is maybe a funnier guy than people give him credit for, because he's talking about a normal day for him, and he kind of is poking a little bit of fun at himself here. Like, he's like, what, when you don't have company, which is preferred at dinner, what should you read? And he says, it would be a kind of blasphemy to read poetry at the table. And, I don't read a lot of poetry, so I kind of get what he's saying here. Poetry's like high-minded and all of that, not appropriate at the dinner table. So what does Lewis say? He says, what one wants is a gossipy, formless book which can be opened anywhere. And here's where he's, the punchline here for Lewis is, so what does Lewis think is a gossipy, formless book? Oh, well, Boswell and Lang's History of English Literature, a translation of Herodotus. There's also a book called The Anatomy of Melancholy that I've already ordered because the title's just intriguing, and maybe it'll be good, maybe it won't. But that's what Lewis is talking about when he says, gossipy and formless. He's kind of poking fun at the idea of, he's this stodgy old guy. Even when he was young, he's, kind of stodgy and old. There's really not much more to discuss about the actual theory in this book. It's just kind of a fun look at who Lewis is as a person. Same with the next section on encountering a favorite author for the first time. This is a little bit more because this particular anecdote, Lewis finds a favorite author, and he talks about the first time he read that guy's book, and it opened his eyes. He saw the world in a slightly different way and had a new perspective. That's pretty central to the thesis of the rest of this book, but it is really just an anecdote, so we can kind of skip these two sections. They're important to read if you want to understand who Lewis is, but you could just skip it. We could skip it for the purposes of this book report. This last section we could have also skipped, but the title is very, not really provocative, but intriguing given today's current situation, we can say. The title is Why Movies Sometimes Ruin Books. So it's going to open with similar complaints that today's book lovers / snobs think about how movies sometimes ruin books. So the anecdote goes basically like this. Lewis is, sitting around, and some of his friends are like, hey, you really liked this book. They made a movie of it. Come with us. We're going to go watch it. You should come with us. And Lewis is like, I don't really like movies. I'd rather stay here and read a book. And they finally convince him. He goes, he watches this movie, and he hates it. He hates the movie. It's a terrible experience for Lewis. I mean, he probably has fun with his friends, but he hates the movie. And a lot of his complaints are going to be very similar to things you hear today from the book lovers / snobs. There's, some overlap. If you drew a Venn diagram, you'd find people in a little of the boat, some of the overlap, some on just one side or the other. Point is, before nerds on the internet were fighting over whether we should add characters to the Lord of the Rings or whatever, C.S. Lewis was hating hating books turned into movies before it was cool. Sarcasm aside, Lewis brings up another argument you've probably heard a bunch, and I'm going to paraphrase instead of a quote. They changed the ending, so now it sucks. In the book, he talks about this somber ending. The protagonists are being buried alive, and they have to overcome this existential dread. I don't think he uses existential. They have to overcome this dread and, work together to find a way out of this problem. But the movie, the director, is like, that's lame. You know what we need? We need an erupting volcano and an earthquake. And Lewis, all those years ago, said something that you probably have heard your book lovers / snobs friends say about movies today. Perhaps the scene in the original was not cinematic, Lewis said, and the director was right by the canons of his own art in altering it. But it would have been better not to have chosen in the first place A story which could be adapted to the screen only by being ruined. Ruined at least for me. I mean, that's his. That doesn't go much to the main thesis of the rest of the book, right? Um, and so I'm really curious how it ended up getting lumped in here. It's a neat story about Lewis, and it's kind of fun to see him like just like talking about like I hated this movie, it sucked. But I don't see where it furthers any of the argument in the rest of the book. But it's fun, and I wanted to spend some time on it because I get to talk about hopefully not it doesn't always have to suck. I have actually four movies I think are actually better than their books. Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the movie, is great. The book, also really good, but let's face it, how many of you knew that it was based on a book? Then, of those of you who knew it, how many of those are because I've told you that before? And how many of you have read the book? Forrest Gump, also a book, but the movie's way better. It's one of those stories that just the cinematicness of it works better, and because books that are turned into movies, the movies are essentially a chance for like a second draft, and you can cut out the bad parts, and Forrest Gump needed some of that. Not as much as the next example of The Godfather, which is one of the best movies of all time, and possibly one of the worst books I've read. The book's okay, but I don't think I would have thought the book was okay if I didn't associate it with the movie, right? Like if I had just read The Godfather and there was no movie out there to compare it to, it would have been a forgettable book. Um, One of the reasons is my fourth example, The Dirty Dozen. For those of you who don't know, the story is basically World War II. America needs people to go on a suicide mission, and someone somewhere in the chain of command is like, why don't we use a whole bunch of soldiers who are condemned and like give them like a second shot? That's the story of The Dirty Dozen. So what do you think the climax should be? It should be that exciting mission where, these 12 people we've been following, some who, were rightly condemned, some who did a crime, but you can feel for them. It was justified. And you want to see them go on this mission, come together, succeed, and come back and, get, their pardons, their whatever. No, that's not where the book ends. The the climactic mission is like an afterword that they don't really care much about. The movie does it right. The mission in Germany is the climax of the movie. It's the exciting focal point, and it does the story that you, the reader, the watcher, were expecting. So, I don't think I'm necessarily a book snob because I'm like, no, there are some times where movies can be better than books. Or movies deliver an experience that a book can't. Like The Lord of the Rings, the movies are very different than the books, but they're not worse. They're not better. They're different. One last fun fact about Lewis's life is one of the things he specifically talks about is that in a book you have a different kind of fear you can get over. And he talks about, there are like internal, this somber melancholy, these internal fears. And he's, talking about it, and then he talks about, and there are just some fears that, like ghosts and insects that are just scarier in books than I've seen done in movies. And that seems like a weird throwaway, but I don't remember if I actually mentioned this in our first part of this book report. Ghosts and insects are specifically two things Lewis says he as a kid was afraid of. So it's just interesting that this piece where he's talking about, fears that are better translated in books. He's like, and my childhood fears that I still remember and I remember quite clearly, keenly being afraid of. Done better in the books I read as a kid. Again, I don't understand. Like, it's an interesting article, essay, I don't even know what to call it, but I don't see how it fits in the whole joy of reading, or I don't get how it fits here, but or the reading life. I don't get how it fits here, but it's such an interesting insight into who Lewis is as a person, and quite possibly one of the earliest examples of someone just absolutely hating the movie version of a book, that you should read it. It's just that interesting. Unless you don't care, and then don't read it. So next book report, whenever that will be, we're going to close out this first section of the book. This first part has been called On the Art and Joy of Reading. And to close it out, we're going to talk about, let me make sure I've got these titles right, how to murder words, how to then save words from the eulogistic abyss. Lewis is going to also talk about the achievements of Tolkien, the dangers of confusing saga with history, and on the 2 ways of traveling and the 2 ways of reading. That will take us to the end of the first part, and then we can start preparing to read about short readings on reading. So hopefully this time all of the audio is nice and clear, or clear enough that for our amateur hour here. But thank you.